For generations, the world has been fed a disordered story about Africa and its people. We were taught that Africa was a dark continent with no history before Europeans arrived, and that colonialism and slavery were somehow civilizing forces. They lied to us. The truth is that Africa had great empires, rich cultures, and advanced knowledge long before colonizers arrived. Africans shaped global history, but their stories were erased, twisted, or hidden. From Mansa Musa's wealth to the stolen Benin Bronzes, from the brutality of colonialism to the whitewashing of slavery. This episode will set the record straight. Most of us grew up with textbooks that gave Africa a couple of pages, often starting with European explorers discovering it. But the continent was full of thriving kingdoms, trade routes, and centers of knowledge long before Europeans stepped foot there. Take Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in the 14th century. Historians agree he was the richest man who ever lived. Mali controlled nearly half the world's gold at the time. On his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, Musa gave away so much gold that he crashed Egypt's economy for years. One historian said the only way to grasp his fortune was to imagine as much gold as you think a human could possess and double it. But Musa wasn't just about gold. He invested heavily in learning. Under his rule, Timbuktu became one of the world's greatest centers of knowledge. Its libraries housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on science, law, math, and medicine. Scholars from across Africa and the Middle East came to study there. When Moroccan forces invaded centuries later, locals smuggled many manuscripts away in trunks and even buried them underground to protect them. Some of those manuscripts survive to this day. Fragile pages written by African scholars that prove Africa had universities, libraries, while much of Europe was still struggling to rebuild from the Middle Ages. And Mali wasn't alone. In southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe built massive stone cities between the 11th and 15th centuries. The walls, made of nearly 1 million cut stones stacked without mortar, still stand today. Yet when Europeans first saw them in the 1800s, they refused to believe Africans had built them. A German explorer in 1871 claimed only a civilized, meaning white, nation could have done it. Others credit Phoenicians, Arabs, even King Solomon, anything but Africans. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeologists finally confirmed what locals always knew. Great Zimbabwe was an African achievement, and in West Africa, the Kingdom of Benin was producing art that rivaled Europe's finest, the Benin Bronzes. Intricate brass and bronze plaques and sculptures showed kings, warriors, and rituals with incredible detail. When the British looted them in 1897, Victorians were stunned. They couldn't believe Africans had made such masterpieces. Some even suggested Europeans must have taught them. These examples prove Africa was not a land of primitives, it was full of empires, engineers, scholars, and artists. But colonizers buried these stories to make conquest seem justified. When European powers invaded Africa in the late 1800s, they didn't say it was about greed, they said it was about civilizing. French leader Jules Ferry declared in 1883, superior races have a duty to civilize inferior races. But the reality was violence and exploitation. The Congo Free State under Belgian King Leopold II is one of the clearest examples. Villagers were forced to harvest rubber under impossible quotas. Those who failed were whipped, mutilated, or killed. Men, women, and children had hands cut off to terrorize others into obedience. Missionaries and travelers described villages where baskets of severed hands were collected as proof of soldiers had done their job. Children orphaned, communities starved, entire regions depopulated. Historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, up to 10 million people died in the Congo. That's the population of a modern-day country wiped out, and it was all for profit. This wasn't unique. In Namibia, German colonial forces carried out the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero and the Nama peoples. Across Africa, rebellions against colonial rule was crushed with extreme brutality. Yes, colonizers built railroads and ports, but not for Africans. They were built to move resources out faster. Gold, diamonds, rubber, oil, clinics and schools were often reserved for colonialists or used to train locals for menial jobs. Colonization wasn't a gift, it was organized theft on a global scale. Colonizers didn't just steal resources, they stole Africa's heritage. The Benin Bronzes are the most famous example. In 1897, British troops invaded Benin City, burned it, and looted thousands of artworks. 10 ships carried away bronzes, ivory, and other treasures. Many ended up in the British Museum, the Berlin Ethnological Museum, and collections in America. When Europeans first displayed them, they were shocked. How could a people they considered savages create art this refined? The bronzes showed such advanced techniques that some refused to believe Africans made them. The truth eventually came out, but by then the art was in European hands. To this day, most of these bronzes remain outside of Africa. Only recently have a few been returned, after more than a century of demands. And then in Benin, bronzes are just one case. The Rosetta Stone, taken from Egypt, sits in London. Ethiopian treasures from Magdala are in British archives. Statues, masks, jewelry, manuscripts, much of Africa's history sits in glass cases thousands of miles from home, while the rightful owners are told the artifacts are safer in Europe. By holding on to these objects, colonizers controlled the story. They decided how the world would see African culture, exotic but never equal. The same distortion happened in the Americas. They lied to us about slavery. In 2015, a Texas textbook described enslaved Africans as workers brought to America. Not enslaved, not kidnapped, just workers, as if they had signed up for jobs. The reality was far worse. Between the 1500s and 1800s, about 12 million Africans were forcibly shipped across the Atlantic. Millions died in the mail passage. Those who survived were sold as property, their names, families, and cultures often stripped away. And slavery wasn't a side note in American history. It was the foundation of its economy. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved people were worth $3.5 billion, more than all U.S. factories and railroads combined. Cotton picked by enslaved hands made up almost 60% of U.S. exports. As historian David Blight put it, Atlantic civilization in the 19th century was built on the back of the enslaved field hand. But schools rarely frame it this way. Instead, we get a vague talk of plantations and trade, as if slavery was just another part of life. The truth, whippings, chains, forced breeding, families torn apart, was downplayed. And even after slavery ended, lies continued. The myth of the lost cause painted slavery as benevolent and confederacies as noble. And then came the promise of 40 acres and a mule. After the Civil War, free men were told they would receive land to finally be independent. Some actually began settling in Georgia and South Carolina, but President Andrew Johnson reversed the order, returning land to former Confederates. Black families were left with nothing. No wealth, no land, no mule. It was one more betrayal, one more lie that shaped generations of poverty. So why does all of this matter? Because the stories we are told shape how we see ourselves and others. If you are taught Africa had no history, you are more likely to see its people as inferior. If colonialism is framed as civilizing, you might excuse its violence. If slavery is softened, you might dismiss calls for justice today. But the truth tells a different story. Africa had empires, universities when Europe was in dark ages. Colonization killed millions and robbed nations. Slavery built modern economies and left scars that still show in wealth gaps and systemic racism. Knowing the truth changes how we understand the world and how we see Africa and its diaspora. History is often written by the victors. Colonizers wrote Africa's story to glorify themselves and hide their crimes, but their lies are unraveling. We now know Mansa Musa was the richest man who ever lived, and Mali, a center of learning. We know Great Zimbabwe and Benin created wonders rivaling any civilization. We know colonization wasn't charity, it was exploitation on a massive scale. We know slavery wasn't a side note, it was the backbone of economies, and its effects are still felt today. They lied to us, but we won't live in that lie anymore. The truth is out there, and it's our responsibility to share it, to honor the ancestors, to reclaim the narrative, and to remind the world that Africa was never poor, it was plundered.